Welcome to the Audacious Living Podcast, hosted by my man, Audley Stevenson, the Odd Man. He'll unpack wisdom and insights from a cross-section of top quality performers in business, media, sports, entertainment, and lifestyle to uncover key elements to help you live your best audacious life ever. So without further ado, here is the Odd Man.
Greetings and salutations to Audley Stevenson, and you've got it locked to the most audacious podcast on the web. This is the Audacious Living Podcast, and it's always a pleasure to be here as we continue our goal of helping you live your best audacious life ever. So thank you. It's always a pleasure to share, and it's always a pleasure to connect with you, and you can do so on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, as well as YouTube, and I'd encourage you to like, follow, subscribe, share, retweet, tell a friend, do whatever you got to do to spread the audacious word of this podcast. So again, thank you for being here. The topic of the conversation on this week's episode is mental health, and we're specifically going to target mental health in the workplace. Considering that we spend so much of our time at work, whether that be working at home or working in the office, it actually makes sense to dive deeper into this topic because, again, so much of our time and energy and mental capacity is spent in this space. I think we can all agree that the last 12 to 15 months have been challenging, to say the least. When you look at how we were impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw small businesses have to close down. Some people lost jobs. Others are forced to say goodbye to loved ones. You look at the senseless killing of George Floyd and many others that followed, and how that elevated the anti-Black racism tensions that now most recently spilled over to the Asian community. There's a lot that's gone on, and it's been tough. They've all taken a mental toll on so many of us. A recent Angus Reid study indicates that 50% of adults are experiencing some form of mental health, which is astounding because that speaks to the fact that so many of us are impacted. So definitely there's mental health concerns out there. Rui Nunes is the host of the Mind at Work podcast, and which engages in conversations that help people and individuals find fulfillment at work while recognizing that psychological behaviors can influence our attitudes towards the workplace. And again, we spend so much of our time there, so this is really a big and relevant topic. Rui will join me on the podcast this week to explore the topic of mental health in the workplace and take a bit of a deeper dive. And we'll also discuss we'll talk employee empowerment, as well as what we can do in the workplace to empower ourselves. And I think that's a really important topic because both sides, both the employer and employee, have a responsibility that they can equally share in making this workplace comfortable and happy from a mental health standpoint. It really was an interesting conversation, and I think many of you enjoy it. Rui brought up some fascinating points, and it's definitely worth a listen. So without any further ado, here is Rui Nunes. So I think what I thought, Rui, would be a sort of good starting point, because I know obviously a lot of your work around workplace empowerment and employee empowerment at work. And I think it's actually a really interesting topic, considering where we are now and how much the landscape of the workplace has changed. So perhaps kind of let's sort of start there in terms of what you're seeing now versus maybe where we were prior to the pandemic.
Yeah, so I could even go a little further back to than that. I guess it'd probably be helpful, but I think we've all had experiences in the workplace that have been less than ideal, right? Whether it's the manager you hoped you never had, or the organizational culture you hope to never have participated in, and I'm sure many people, and obviously there's the fortunate few that have been exposed to those types of environments, and they can be, in many in many of the worst cases, they can be debilitating and take you out of work and send you home. And then you're just trying to essentially figure things out. And that's never easy. And then in better situations, or still less than ideal, is that you're going through work and you're just checking a box, right? And you're not really there, which now we refer to as presenteeism, right? So it's essentially you're there, but you're not really there. Do you know what I mean? You're not working at your best. So
almost lacking that sort of emotional connection, if you will, that keeps you connected to the work that you're doing.
Exactly, whether it's drive or passion or purpose or whatever other word you want to use that helps you get connected to the work you're doing and deliver value. It's just missing, right? You're no longer connected to that. And there's a variety of reasons. And in some cases, it has nothing to do with work, right? In some cases, it could be your personal life and stuff that you're dealing with there. But we've all experienced that. And for me, I've also openly had conversations about mental health and what that means, and touching on the fact that these, mental health many times precedes our working experience, right? It's typically outside of traumatic events, but it's typically formed during our childhood, right? And these are things that we learn that influence who we become later in life. Mm-hmm. So for me, anxiety, is the mental health, I guess, issue, is whether you want to call it an issue or something else, of choice for me. Well, or not necessarily choice, but the one that at least I've been challenged with over a number of years. And for me, it allowed me to really start to spend some time to discover what that was, how it works, what it meant, both philosophically and scientifically. And I've seen directly the impact it has in what you do on a day-to-day basis at work and at home. And with Mind at Work, the impetus for that initiative is to start to evangelize and generate real evidence-based awareness around what that means and what is mental health, what is wellness, right, in the workplace, and how do we foster these environments that are constructive, but also allow us to communicate to more business-oriented individuals who not necessarily directly suggesting that they lack self-awareness, so to speak, but maybe their focus is in a different area. But how do we help them understand, or everybody understand, the real business implications of mental health in the workplace? Because that usually moves the needle a lot faster.
Well, and Rui, as you're talking, so what I'm thinking about is, and we're probably maybe a little better than we were before, but these are things that companies and employers and managers and bosses and CEOs really didn't have to think about or take into consideration. They're able to, their job was to focus on the business side, that bottom line, generating revenues, whatever it was, their metric was. And this other stuff really didn't come into play. But now, things have changed, and I think there's still a lot more work to do, but we're starting to see a change, aren't we?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot more empathy today than there has been ever before. And a lot of the times we need to experience these types of events ourselves to really better understand what it means to other people, right? So we were put into that position to really understand what the implications of poor mental health are, right? The pandemic put us in that way, right? We had to socially isolate. We no longer had to. We were no longer able to, or had the luxury of having the core human need, right? The social interaction. Now we're stuck inside, whatever building we're in to live, right? Every single day. And all we can do is have dialogue like this. So yes, there's definitely a lot more empathy now from companies. But I should preface this by saying there were also a lot of companies pre-COVID that were still very empathetic and forward thinking in the mental health space and investing heavily in that area, which is always a great sign. You always have early adopters of any form, whether technology solution, et cetera. But now I think you're starting to see a lot more of that pick up. However, with that said, and this is probably more of a controversial opinion from my perspective, I've had this with other experts as well, is that my belief right now is that mental health has been popularized, but it hasn't been accepted, right? and I'm talking about it at a broader scale. I think people do evangelize, they do talk about it, but the authentic, genuine understanding of mental health and the willingness to, support it and build the programs necessary at organizations isn't there yet. And albeit
Funny,
we've
I was
made
going to say, I
progress.
was just about to say, sorry to cut you off there. I was just about to say to you, what does that look like then, or what should be happening, or what is supposed to be happening, so to address your concerns? So are you saying sort of more workplace programs is the idea?
Well, I think there's more than that, because I think there's a mutual responsibility, one from the employer and the other from the employee, right?
Okay.
So it's not to say that it's only the employer's responsibility to go out and make sure all their employees' mental health is in prime state. The employee also needs to make sure that they're doing all the necessary things in order to be, physically in shape, mentally in shape, in order to live a healthier life, right? But as an employer who has, in some cases, access to more capital, has access to human and financial capital, there's an opportunity there for the employer to take more of a lead in influencing positive change in people's lives, right? And sort of the metaphor that I use is almost like the parent-child relationship, right? When you're a child, you're essentially, you don't know that you should eat your broccolis, right? Like, you don't know that you should have your greens. You don't know that you need to go to sleep at a certain time, right? Like, you're going life, right? Like, you're just doing what you can to squeeze out a little bit more time here and there and eat a little more pizza or French fries. You know what I mean? Like, that's so.
Enjoy
I think
the ride.
Exactly. So I think that employers need to kind of really take that mindset of, we understand that people are being shifted and encouraged to take actions that aren't necessarily aligned with people's well-being and wellness, and that's whether it's advertising, social norms, etc. How do we now become more proactive in how do we build behavioral change programs in the organization, right? Whether it's behavioral change around addiction, or whether it's behavioral change around increasing the likelihood of exercise, or adopting new habits like mindfulness, right? How do we take that more proactive? I think those are going to be the organizations you start to see take a lead in in the culture aspect and human capital. That's where people are going to want to work. I think millennials have been pretty vocal about they want to work for organizations that believe in them, that have a positive culture. The chips, healthy snacks, ping pong table, fridge full of beer, all that stuff was cool 10 years ago, even up to 5 years ago. I think that's you're starting to see a shift really on where the priorities lie for individuals, and especially high performers looking for their new roles.
I got all sorts of questions think in my mind, things I want to touch on, because you made a bunch of really good points. The one thing I want to kind of go back to, you made references or the early adopters and organizations were sort of ahead of the curve, so to speak. Can you sort of give some examples of things that they did from the start to sort of that fell in line with what we're talking about?
Yeah, so what I'm about to explain is more so anecdotal than based on any form of research, right? So I think the companies that you saw quickly adapt to sort of that shift into remote were companies that already had inherent programs in the organization that supported and facilitated a lot of these core human needs, right? So whether it's a pre-existing remote work policy with certain procedures, right? So what do you do when you work remote? Do you have a laptop? Do you have a setup at home? Do they have a sort of an ergonomic fund for the employee? So they have, I was just talking to some folks recently about this, one who's a specialist in ergonomics, right? Like, do you have the working environment? Does your employer facilitate the needs to set up a working environment at home should you need it? So the organizations that had those pre-COVID saw, albeit I'm sure they faced a lot of, an uphill battle going through a lot of the things that that we weren't expecting,
Right.
But at least their employees had a much more of a head start in like getting home, getting their desk set up ready, getting their environment ready, and understanding what procedures, how to have a meeting, where, how long it should be. Do you have a gap from one meeting to the other? Like, they had all these things figured out well before COVID happened.
Wow. And things that we probably would take for granted. I think one of the, you sort of touched on, gap in between meetings. It's really easy to sit in your chair at your desk and bang one meeting after the other. And at the end of the day, it's like, all you've done is maybe you've gone from the chair and maybe the washroom and back, if anything.
That's
And
that.
there's all these other aspects of the day that you've just had a miss because you've been confined to this area in space. And so the thought that there is actually sort of policy around that, if you will, around the shoulds and shouldn't and things of that nature, that's phenomenal to hear. That's, again, forward thinking for sure.
Yeah, and you have to think about too, right? Like this isn't it's not like what some would call like the sort of like woo-woo stuff, right? Like we're not like guessing at this anymore, right? We know, for example, context switching, like to speak to your point around jumping from one meeting to the next, right? We already understand, like science has already proven this time and time again. It takes us about 15 minutes on average, in some cases 20 minutes to context switch, meaning can you go from one topic to the next topic and truly provide value going from one to the next? So
I have no idea. That is a new one for me.
yeah, so there's this
Wow.
this belief that people can multitask. Well, that's a fallacy. People have proven that time and time again. That doesn't exist, right? Like you can pretend, like you can switch, you can do multitask switching, meaning I can write an email, leave that email, go to Slack and write a Slack, but like I'm not doing the same thing or two things at the same time, right? Like that's impossible.
We're talking about
Unless
doing
for
well.
motor skill wise. So I can chew gum and walk, right? Don't get me wrong, right? That's multitasking, but it's not knowledge work essentially, which is what a lot of the people are faced with now, at least with some of these challenges. But the context switching factor is significant, and it's a big impact to business, right? If you don't add that buffer from one meeting to the next, you're essentially and assuming, let's say we were in a meeting together, right? Or we were in separate meetings before, but then we jumped onto this meeting or this conversation. If you went from like the minute before to jump onto this talk, there's going to be a period of time where you're just getting your bearings and your mind up to speed on where you need to be, right? And the challenge with that is that you now not just wasting your time trying to get up to speed, now you're wasting my time getting up to speed. Now imagine you have a meeting with 10 people, right? The financial implications of that are significant. So instead of saying, hey, let's go back to back, and Google has this as a default feature in Google Calendar if you use the G Suite, like this is normal stuff that's available today and it's completely free, where you just say, hey, I want that buffer. So I have a few minutes before the next meeting so that I have some time to really get up to speed to the next one. So by the time I go into that meeting, it's effective.
Right. It's I guess it's just so fascinating. And if you think of when the pandemic started and it hit, it didn't give us the time to think about all those things, except for those that were ahead of the curve, as you sort of talked about. But I think what's happening is we're slowly learning, and what I'm most intrigued at is when we come out of the other side of this, what do things look like then? And sort of is that readjustment back, or I would imagine that there will be some that it's almost like I heard the expression of it's like the genie's out of the bottle with respect to working from home, and then some may never go back, right? So it's just all these questions around what will life look like after the pandemic.
Yeah, and there's some organizations that have already said that they're going to be working remote 100%. They've already made that statement, right? So, and these are typically some of the bigger organizations out there, but also some smaller organizations have come out and already said that, hey, look, we're adopting remote work entirely. We believe that's the ideal next step, and they're shifting the office environment into more of sort of like a social working environment, right? Like you can come into the office if you want, you can book some desks, maybe you come in with your team. It's not mandatory that you come in, but that social aspect of work is also valuable for us mentally to be able to come in and really interact with folks face to face.
That's so good. I'm so glad to hear, because thinking, I'm sure there'll be cases where they'll shut down the office altogether and not see any value in it at all. But if that's still maintained and it's shifted where it's a bit more social, because I think that's the piece in all this that can't be forgotten about in terms of its levels of importance.
Yeah, and it's gonna be interesting to see how. I don't think anybody knows, right? Like there have been plenty of companies pre-COVID that were 100% remote, right? Like that's their business was completely focused on employees globally, and they didn't even have a single office, and in some cases maybe just one office, right? And a lot of them worked out and they were fine. The question always is, how do you cultivate the physical social dynamic, right? Like there's a big difference between being on a Zoom call all day than me being across the table from you and having a chat and then go grabbing a coffee or tea or whatever that is. It just, you can't replace that human interaction, right? The human element. So post COVID, my assumption is going to be at least that you are going to see those companies making that shift, right? You're going to see companies going into that partial remote work. You're going to get sort of that 3-2 split or the 4-1 split, right? So from home to office, you're going to get some that are going to be super flexible, but you're going to have some that are going to go back completely.
Right.
And they're just going to say, nope, we're a work from the office company, and that's that's the culture we want to cultivate, and that's what we want to do. So again, I'm not an expert in sort of the cognitive implications, psychological aspects of what that means for employees in the workplace, but I'm sure that it's going to be interesting to see how the workforce changes once we get past the critical pandemic issues, and we can start to really go back to normal.
Gotcha. So, I'm certainly not putting you on a spot or holding you to this, Rui, but what do you think it'll be when it's all said and done?
Well, look, I'm a firm believer that history repeats itself, right? And I think that we're going to get people or companies rather, that are going to, whether it's ignore what the real implications are or return to their original modus operandi, right? And they're going to be fine with that. I think that what we're going to start to see a lot more of, though, which is good, and you're starting to see a lot of indications of this, is that you are seeing a broader adoption of the impact that mental health has in the workplace, and companies investing in what's really important for their employees. And that's thanks to a lot of the research, the scientific research and evidence that's been coming out and released at a faster pace now than ever before, that demonstrates that the impact that this work has in a workplace. And you have a lot of the big consultancies coming out with their research, right, and demonstrating the ROI and the business impact, which also has a positive impact in continuing to move this forward. And further to that, I think what excites me as well is, like I said, I still believe that the mental health conversation is popularized, not necessarily accepted, but significant improvement from where we were 10 years ago. And we're starting to see that in a lot of different avenues, right? And as another example, neurodiversity. It was a topic that I was unfamiliar with. I was not knowledgeable in that area whatsoever. And I've had a couple conversations in the past couple months just entirely about neurodiversity, and companies building programs to hire for people that are on the spectrum. And how do you now start to incorporate folks who have autism or Tourette's or other, whether you refer to them as disabilities otherwise, how do you bring them into the workforce, and how do you set them up for success, right? How do you integrate them, right? And even, like, again, you continue to see this, which is great, which is, like I said, the neurodiversity. Then there's the racial diversity, the gender diversity. Like, all these topics now are starting to become so much more frequent, and they're getting so much more to the spotlight, albeit we always want them to get more, but like, we're making strides and making that happen, which is positive over the coming years.
Well, I mean, really what I'm hearing, Rui, is that we're opening up to more and more perspectives, but we're open to being open to these perspectives and understanding how to integrate and inform or help develop the workforce. Because for the longest time, these groups, some of the groups you mentioned, didn't really even have a voice and wasn't considered at all.
Yeah, that's right. And it's unfortunate, right? Like, especially, you can go down the rabbit hole having these conversations and figuring out really where it all stems from, right? And what the cause of it was. And unfortunately, some folks, they think in a certain way that's not necessarily open-minded or empathetic or considerate of who other people are and their own life experiences and all that stuff, right? But I think if we understand that, at the end of the day, there are psychological influences that impact people's perception of what a status quo should look like, right? And at the end of the day, we're all human beings, and we're all influenced in different ways. We're all influenced based on our upbringing. We're all influenced based on environmental factors, right? Like, we didn't come in as a child into this world and say, I immediately don't want this group of people to be in the workforce with me, right? Like that's not who they were as a child growing up. And I think the more that we have these conversations, the more we demonstrate the impact of having this openness and this acceptance to everyone, I think it's going to have much bigger and much better outcomes for future generations, right? This is no longer going to be blanketed as like, hey, you don't see this anymore, right? It's like what I don't know doesn't hurt me. Like, no, now everybody knows, right? You have social media, you have all this, everybody's talking about everything. And I think that as much as social media has been, has created negative implications in society, it has also facilitated a lot of great conversation, especially in the recent years.
Sure. No, and you're right. I think, I've often said social media, there's pros and cons, there's good and bad, however you want to categorize them. But I certainly, if you want to focus on sort of the one side, the good side, if you will, it opens up dialogue, it creates conversation, it gives voices to those who may not necessarily have that voice. And so, those now can be taken and again, applied to the workplace. And it opens up, again, tremendous opportunities. So I think it's fantastic, man. Incredible stuff. It truly is.
Yeah. And I'm looking forward to seeing where this all goes, right? In terms of a lot of these programs that companies are starting to implement. And I think, like I said earlier, there's going to be companies that are going to be a bit more forward thinking, and there's going to be companies that are going to make changes quicker than others. But as we start to see these trailblazers start to really earn the respect of a lot of individuals, have this positive brand, this positive brand being aligned with what other folks in society are interested in pursuing, right? That's when you're going to start to see a lot of change happen, right? And to be honest, it's one of the things is going to be where you're going to notice a company scale really quickly, or various companies scale really quickly. They have a culture of they focus on diversity, openness, awareness, focus on mental health, and they cover all of the core human needs. But additionally, you start to see a scale in revenue, because now people feel that connection to the brand. They're willing to put in the work necessary. Their cognitive functioning is far greater than somebody who's depressed at work, doesn't want to be there, checked out, right? And we've seen, I think some studies we recently talked about, like there's like as much as a 30% decrease in cognitive functioning for a lot of these other factors. And the moment you eliminate that debilitation, and you actually add a superpower on top of it, or more horsepower on it, you're going to start to see organizations really start to skyrocket.
So much that goes back to that culture we talked about earlier, creating that culture that is inclusive and allows, and inclusivity is a conversation we're having more and more of as well. So when you create that culture that allows for me to be me, and however that looks like, whether it's in a virtual world, because it very well may end up being we're all virtual in some companies, or the non-virtual, or a blend of both. I still think it goes back to what the framework is established, and in framework, I mean, in that culture is established, what's established.
Yeah, and leaders really need to start to take note and spend some time to understand what they're trying to accomplish, right? Because they are, cultures are set as a result of leadership, right? If leaders in the organization are setting a positive tone of whatever the topic is, the culture is going to follow suit, right? People are going to go and do as they see, right? Not do as what they're told, as we've often been told in the past. So, we need leaders to really stand up and have these conversations to demonstrate vulnerability, right? To show to people that even amidst the success they've had and achieved, it wasn't without hardship. It wasn't without having to build that resilience of getting through that. And there's probably been breakdowns along the way, and that's normal, and that's fine. And they have outlets to be able to have those conversations about emotion and what that means and how you're feeling, right? These are all conversations that were completely unheard of in organizations in the past. And now you start to see a lot of people just come out and say, hey, look, I'm not feeling well today. Like you know what, I've had a bad day, and I'm burnt out, right? Burnout, massive conversation that's happening right now, and it's becoming more acceptable. So more leaders need to take a stand and come out and say, hey, you know what? I seem like I'm a workaholic and I'm working a lot, and I don't expect you to do that. That's just my way of working, and it's completely fine. And then people will feel much more relief of not having to now put their own well-being at risk in order to keep their jobs.
Got you. Rui, this has certainly been enlightening in terms of the perspectives that you've opened up, and I appreciate you doing that. One last thing I want to touch on before we get out of here, and again, thank you for the time. This is, I would imagine you entered a number of conversations through your work with different people in terms of opening this up. For some, you're probably opening up some areas of understanding. For my case, a little bit of that. And for others, it's all sort of, not necessarily brand new, but they kind of touched on some things, understand some things. I would imagine everyone sort of can relate, because we've all had, those good bosses or bad bosses, or good employers or bad employers. What kinds of things are you hearing back from people when you start to open up these dialogues about the idea of mindful at work?
Yeah, so one of the big things is really quantifying some of the work that people are doing out there. And what I mean by that is that we're still in the stage of improving workplace well-being, where we need to look at the numbers, right? We need to understand the value it drives for the business. And if anybody's looking at that, whether you're in a people position or in a leadership position, it's going to be really important to be able to correlate the business impact, the employee impact, to the program you're trying to put in at your organization. Recently, I spoke to a mindfulness expert, and what he explained to me very eloquently was that I don't go in and try to teach organizations about mindfulness as this, sort of ambiguous topic of like, I want to be a better version of myself. What he does is he says, this is a skill acquisition tool. And as a result of learning mindfulness, you're going to have more productive meetings. You're going to have reduced negative conflict. You're going to have people who are more present in the workplace and more aware. So he's directly correlating the skills acquired through the practice of mindfulness and the impact on the business. So that should be the case with any program that anybody's considering implementing into organizations today, is really to start to think about what are the positive business impacts that these programs would have that would help move the business forward.
The piece I love about that is that, this doesn't just apply to a professional life. These are things that we can take over into our personal world. So you talked about the skill acquisition. Conflict in our personal life exists, and how do you manage it, and how do you deal with that? So I think those are all phenomenal, great points. Good stuff to close off. Rui, where can listeners go to not only look at your work, but even check out your podcast?
Yeah, so thanks for the plug. And my podcast is on mindatwork.io. And that's just an initiative that I started, a passion project that I'm focused on right now on the side, to essentially try to evangelize some of this. And I interview folks that are experts around psychology, organizational culture, design, mindfulness experts, like I mentioned earlier, and even CEOs and other founders and entrepreneurs, to share their experiences and their understanding of what it's really going to take in order to improve workplace well-being.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you, Rui, opening up this world, and certainly opening perspectives. I found it interesting and insightful. And even when we were sort of talking about connecting, I was like, oh my, I was really looking forward to it, because of the fact that, again, everyone can relate, right? Everyone can relate to the workplace. We've all been in a workplace of some sort. So the topic of being mindful at work and what that means and what companies can do is the part that was really intriguing for me. So thank you, much appreciated, and wish you all the best.
Thank you so much for your time, Ali. You're doing great work here.
Appreciate it.
You've been listening to the Audacious Living Podcast, hosted by Audley Stevenson. If you enjoyed what you heard, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Until next time, be audacious.